I don't think I was in that community for more than 2 hours before I got punched in the face the first time, and I started thinking all this theoretical stuff at university has some application, and it's definitely interesting, but the world's a slightly different place than academia.
Welcome back to the Northern Sentinels podcast. I'm your host, Chris Ayotte. On this episode, I'm joined by Calvin Chrustie. A proud Winnipeger, Cal grew up on the boundary between the right and the wrong side of the tracks. He learned a lot about grit and resilience from having a foot in both worlds. Fortunately, strong values and work ethic landed him on the good side of the law, literally. After university, he joined the RCMP and spent the next 32 years working everything from organized crime to UN operations to hostage negotiations. After retiring from the Mounties, Cal started a business focused on dealing with critical risks for governments, corporations, and individuals. He's especially passionate about educating people on the threats associated with hybrid warfare. Before we get to our guest, a quick word from Mark Gasparato of Gasparato Group, a veteran-owned small business and our partner for this podcast episode.
At the Gasparato Group, we help leaders and teams clear the way to live, learn, and lead into their potential, which translates into greater individual productivity, higher team performance, and ultimately increased organizational profitability. That is why Gasparato Group is trusted by companies like General Dynamics, Ultra Communications, Kongsberg, PureLogic IT, and the Ontario Provincial Police to provide customized leadership development expertise. Quality leadership is not a nice to have, it's a business imperative. How can we help you lead into your potential?
And now, my friends, here's a conversation with Calvin Chrustie. Hey, Cal, great to meet you in person here, and what a fantastic opportunity with you just happened to come out to Ottawa for some work and a chance to sit down in person. So thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
And one of the things I think when we first met that I asked you about was your last name, and wanted to make sure I got the pronunciation right. But what is the background of your last name?
So the background was on my dad's side of the family, immigrants from Western Ukraine, and they immigrated to Manitoba over 100 years ago, and the original name was Chrustie, and my grandfather moved to the prairies, got into farming. The kids continued the farming. He got into business, and his business was in a small town called Alonza, Manitoba, and they had a cafe, pool hall, hotel, a transfer truck, I think a post office, a few other things. And he always had to come into Winnipeg to do business. And that particular name caused some challenges in terms of interacting with the business community in Winnipeg, in terms of discrimination against the Ukrainians at the time, apparently.
Did your dad truncate the name or change the name, or how did that, any idea how that evolved?
It was my grandfather that did it. At the time, and then my father kept it, and other people in the family have kind of flipped back and forth and tried to Anglo-Saxon it to Chrustie rather than Chrustie for obvious humorous reasons, and that. So they did that. And my wife, just as a side note, refused to take it because her name is Chrustie and my name being Chrustie, so she kept her maiden name.
Oh, that's too funny.
Yeah.
What are the odds?
Yeah.
So your dad's side of the family, Ukrainian. What about your mom's side of the family?
Irish and Scottish immigrants.
And when was your mom born in Canada, or was it did you immigrate?
Mom was born in Canada just before the war, and her father and mother parents immigrated. I think it was like in the 1910s or 1900s, like in the early hundreds, like 1905 or so.
And they were both from, I guess, both those families were farming families?
Farming again in terms of southwestern Manitoba.
Okay. So how did their childhoods differ coming from two farming families. Did they have a similar experience growing up, or was it they have different sort of farming experiences as kids?
I'd say, from what I gather, somewhat different. There seemed to be a difference between the Anglo-Saxon farming community, and I remember, not that I'm a farming expert, but the general area that many of the Anglo-Saxons immigrated to at that time was very fertile farming ground, and the Ukrainians were somewhat directed to the less futile or fertile lands, and I think from all accounts was a much tougher go for the Ukrainian immigrants.
And how did your parents meet?
My mother and father were both in the education business. My father was a school principal. I believe it was like in the early 50s in Swan River, Manitoba, and my mother was a teacher there, so they met there.
So obviously they had no desire to carry on the farming legacy, and wanted to do something different.
Yeah, they both left home, pursued higher education, and went into the teaching background. My dad, when he first started, he went up to a somewhat kind of famous place in Manitoba, if there's famous places there, York Factory, which was on the Hudson Bay. And it was a extremely remote Indigenous community, and it was kind of one of the highlights of his career, being in his early 20s, being the only Caucasian person, white person in that community, and he thoroughly enjoyed his 1 to 2 years in terms of teaching in the community, and always spoke fondly in terms of working with Indigenous communities and Indigenous groups.
There might be famous places in Manitoba, but the place that I always think of when somebody says Manitoba is Portage in Maine. That always jumps to mind as people claiming it to be one of the coldest places on earth. And so you're from Winnipeg.
Yeah, born and raised. Yeah, and still consider myself from Winnipeg. When somebody says, "Where are you from?" I rarely say Vancouver. I always say Winnipeg.
And what did your life look like as a kid growing up in Winnipeg?
Pretty good childhood. Well, not pretty good. Excellent childhood. Super fortunate. Remember, when my mom passed away a couple of years ago, one of my friends said, "Hey, you had won a lottery with your parents in terms of the best parents in the neighborhood." So I was considered myself super fortunate. I kind of grew up in kind of a lower class, right on the fringe. So I was fortunate, I grew up more on the middle class side, but several blocks away was the lower class neighborhood. With a little more poverty, a little more challenges in terms of the community. So going to school, I had the combination of growing up like in that middle class society, but also getting exposed to the other side of the society, and particularly as it related to Winnipeg, the more edgy part of the community, and that which Winnipeg's somewhat notorious for in terms of having some rough neighborhoods, etc. So I got exposed to that growing up, which I actually, embrace and value, and think for a lot of different reasons made me a better person, growing up. Being exposed to that growing up. But I played sports, did a whole bunch of things I probably shouldn't have done. Growing up, my neighbors, I still keep in touch with some of them growing up, 40, 50 years later, several of them, like really close friends, ended up having a life in and out of prisons. But I still keep in touch with those guys still to this day.
Yeah, I found that really intriguing. We had a couple times we've spoken before this about how growing up in a part of town where you had a really diverse group of friends, and as a career cop, I mean, was there ever a pull towards the the criminal side of things because you had such a diverse group of friends, and maybe you were exposed to that as a kid?
I mean, I was exposed to criminality, but I was exposed to it like constantly, ranging, from the drug trade to other activity. But, I was super interested in sports. I had some fantastic friends, and I think my mom and dad did a exceptional job in terms of, defining what's right and what's wrong. Probably to the point that it became a bit of a fault and challenging later on in my career, where I saw things, they were either right or they're wrong, and I maintained those principles growing up. So I didn't get swayed, that much, or tempted into that role, but I mean, I was definitely around it all the time.
How much independence did you have as a kid growing up?
So much so that my sister is extremely jealous 40, 50 years later. I had unbelievable independence. I think because my parents maybe came from the farming community where, there's really no oversight. Nothing can really happen in a farming community, in terms of a town of 100 people or whatever. It's pretty safe and secure. So, I used to, 12 years old, be out at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock at nights with my friends riding my bike around. And there wasn't, that concern if my parents were out for dinner or whatever at, their family's place or whatever, at a late night gathering. But I had significant independence.
You told me a story once about your dad putting you on a Greyhound.
Yes.
At 13, and I thought that was a pretty good story that sort of demonstrated how things have changed these days.
Yeah, when you reflect back on it, and that story was obviously at 13 years old, he had a ton of respect for the work ethic, of the farming community, and always reminded me of that growing up as a kid. And even though he was very much in tune with academia, he also believed, the school of hard knocks, hard work was all part of it. So, at 13 years old, one summer he took me to the bus depot in Winnipeg, which at that time was in an extremely sketchy part of the city and rather intimidating for a 13-year-old, and I would say probably at that point, even for a 20 or 30-year-old, that part of the city at that time. And put me on the bus, said to the bus driver, here's where he's going. Can you stop at this address? Handed him a piece of paper and said, let him off at this place on the side of a gravel road. And that was my uncle's place, who had a farm back from where they originally started farming 60 or 70, 80 years before that, 60 probably, at Alonzo, Manitoba, and dropped me off, at 13 years old on the side of a gravel road. And I spent a good part of the summer farming and doing, driving a tractor and that at 13 years old, and kind of realizing that rather quickly. I super enjoyed it, and it's probably one of the fondest memories I've ever had. But that, as a result of some other experiences, doing labor work as a teenager, I realized probably I'm best to go on to university, get an education, and not be a laborer for the rest of my life.
As you got into the later years of high school, you knew you weren't going to go into farming. You wanted to go to university. Did you have, beyond that sort of higher education, did you have a sense of what you wanted to do for a career?
I don't think I really did in high school. At least I don't recall it. I think, as we talked before, I struggled a bit in school growing up. Probably had a little insecurity relative to my education because I had a speech impediment when I was much younger, when I was in grade 2, and I used to get pulled out of school growing up. And would have the odd person make fun of me for my speech impediment, which I eventually got away. Hopefully it doesn't come back today during this podcast. So I think that challenged me, and I think it probably even compromised my mom's confidence, as we've talked about before, in terms of her confidence, in terms of me going on and that. And in school, I was more interested in hanging out with my buddies, having beers on Friday night, playing sports, dating, and just being a normal kind of teenager and having a ton of fun. So I wasn't really thinking about that. And my mom was kind of steering me, I think, in my last year of high school towards being a trade person, plumbing, electrical, carpenter, or whatever. And as we've talked about before, and my dad was going, well, hey, I think he can do university. Let's push him in there, see if he can do it, and maybe create some other opportunities career-wise and that. So,
at what point did the idea of some form of service form in your mind?
I remember actually, and I think it was probably the exposure from particularly my mom, maybe my dad a little bit. I think I was like probably in junior high school, where I always thought I wanted to help people, and I think my mom was probably the most empathetic person on the planet. And she was, involved with her church group, helping people, always helping new immigrants come to Canada from Africa and other places. So I think at that age I was kind of going, hey, I want to help people around the world. Like I remember, now that you say that, I'm having kind of flashbacks lying in bed thinking about, hey, what I'm going to do when I grow up. And I just remembered wanting to help people, even when I was probably in my junior high school years.
What was the first step when you graduated high school then?
First step when I graduated high school, university. I went there to do a general arts program. It was probably in that year when I started having conversations with people trying to figure out what I was going to do. I had my cousin's husband was in the RCMP. And so I started, I think, looking at RCMP. The second year, third year, I met somebody from CSIS in my class that was an adult student. Then I started exploring that. So I was kind of thinking that, reflecting back on it, I wish I met somebody in the military because I probably would have pursued that. But so I started at probably my first or second year university, kind of defining that, hey, I want to go into policing or the intelligence world.
One of my favorite stories you've told me is about you being a summer student with the RCMP, and I still can't wrap my head around that story, but I guess that was your first touch point with the Mounties, was it?
Yes. I had interaction through family members. My family, a lot of my family was Winnipeg City Police, cousins, sister, in-laws, et cetera, et cetera. I think it was my second year. After my second year, I got hired by the RCMP, did a summer at Russell, Manitoba, just a normal kind of prairie town of 1,000 people. And I had applied, I think, at that time for the RCMP full-time in 1982. The advice I got and my thoughts were I should finish my degree because I had a year left. And then when I did finish my degree, they had the freeze on hiring. So the RCMP called me up that spring and said, hey, we've got some good news for you, maybe some bad news too. But and then they offered me a summer job to kind of help me continue on with my education in light of the fact that there wasn't any full-time employment. So I took the summer job. I said, what's the good news? They said, hey, we got the summer job. I said, well, what's the bad news? Because that was a little concerning that they threw that one in. And the bad news was, well, we're not sure what you're going to think of it, but from our personal thing, it's going to be your best life experience. And that was summer at Norway House, Manitoba, which was at that time, I think there was probably 12 members there, 13 members in northern Manitoba. I think they had like 7 or 8 fly-in reserves where you'd go with another member and they drop you off the plane and pick you up a week later or 5 days later. And I think at that time it was considered probably in policing like the most violent collection of communities from a policing perspective. So it was a complete eye-opener, going from the theory of university to God's Lake Narrows in northern Manitoba, and arriving in the community. And I don't know if it was more than 2 hours arriving in the community before I think I was in Norway House for a couple of weeks, but when I went to God's Lake Narrows, which was kind of the epicenter of violence at that time, I don't think I was in that community for more than 2 hours before I got punched in the face the first time, and I started thinking all this theoretical stuff at university has some application, and it's definitely interesting, but the world's a slightly different place than academia.
So how old were you at that point?
I was probably 22. No, I was probably 20 actually. Yeah, maybe 20 at that point. Yeah.
Does the RCMP still run that type of program?
I'm sure they run it, but I don't think they ran it like they did then, because on Sunday night, and I mentioned this before that I'd probably get in trouble saying it, but like on Sunday nights, would be we were in a very isolated community, so the boys would get together. Like I lived in single man barracks, there were 6 of us living there, and it was kind of like, hey, let's get the steaks out, a case of beer, and particularly Sunday nights, that would be kind of the boys' night. And if the boys were on night shift, they would put me on night shift by myself. And so I would patrol that community. That was a community of 5,000 people, and it was a violent community. So I remember driving around, going to gun complaints and going to other complaints, that night in domestic disputes, and not armed, doing the patrol and just kind of keeping my fingers crossed. And when I reflect back on it, I kind of probably wasn't the wisest decision that I made, but different times, different place. It wouldn't happen today. I'm pretty confident of that.
When you finished up with Norway House, you'd already talked about how you obviously had some experience with the RCMP now. You'd also sort of met some people who were with CSIS. How did you end up deciding on going to the RCMP vice, some other avenues?
Well, my strategic approach was the shotgun approach. Apply for a couple jobs, see who takes me. So I applied for CSIS and the RCMP at the same time, went through the process. The timing was, and I was in Ottawa at that time doing my, I guess it would have been my 5th year of university, because the RCMP still wasn't hiring at that point. And I had developed relationships with some CSIS managers and some RCMP managers, so both were kind of supporting me in both paths in terms of pursuing careers. And so I was just going to take, whatever one came first. And the one that came first was, when I went for my final medical for the RCMP, I had it one morning, and with a doctor, and they said, hey, this is the last step. You're probably going to get an offer, blah, blah, because there's nothing in your medical here. And then that afternoon, just complete fluke, I had my final medical with CSIS. And I walked into the, actually, it was the other way around. It was CSIS first, RCMP in the afternoon. And I'm sitting in the RCMP headquarters waiting for the doctor to come in. Door opens, and it's the same doctor from CSIS. I guess they used the same doctors back then. And he looked at me. He says, hey, first of all, I don't have to do the examination because it's the same charts. So we're probably going to have to figure out some time to burn here. But do they know that you're applying for both? Which I didn't tell them both. I just didn't know how to broach that conversation. I just thought, hey, whoever offers me a job, I'm going to go roll with it. So I had to make a quick decision. And I think I just kind of went, CSIS, appeared to be, probably more cerebral thinking, and the RCMP was a little more action orientated. And I thought, at that age, whatever I was at 22, probably more designed to be a little more action orientated guy. I thought I had probably read enough books and written enough papers for a little while so that the RCMP would provide perhaps a greater diversity of opportunities, and that I would probably want to reconsider and go back into CSIS at a later time. And so that's how I made that decision.
Now, the first step for most Mounties is you go to depot.
Yes.
Can you describe to the listener what depot is and what happens there?
So depot, paramilitary training taken from the British military training, 32 persons living in a military type dorm, days starting at whatever it was, I can't remember, 5:15 in the morning, starting with making your bed perfectly to getting dressed, making your perfectly dressed to then, marching, I forget, at 7 o'clock in the morning, then having breakfast, and then going into a series of training scenarios from learning about law, learning about driving, learning about operational things, in terms of how to, intervene in a domestic dispute, how to put handcuffs on people, how to shoot, whatever. And that day would go on till, usually on most days, till 9:30, 9 o'clock at night, where there was an expectation that you'd be doing physical training at night, extra swimming if you're weak in one area, or studying or whatever else for the exam. And it went on for 6 months. And I found it, and I think most people do, and from what I understand, it's changed dramatically since. But the learning about teamwork, that type of training that they used to have, which was a little more towards the military side, where they're yelling and screaming at you, testing your resiliency, building the team, and that. I don't know. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thought it was a great experience, and probably wish they maintained that because of the value that I saw out of it. But I think it's changed since that time.
I can imagine, much like the military, that you formed some pretty deep bonds through that shared experience that lasted throughout your career and probably to this day.
Yeah, I keep in touch. Still, and that's going back almost 40 years, I still keep in touch with many of them. And, as we talked previously, when you reflect back on, those that you met and you start doing the metrics in terms of where everybody ended up, it's really kind of an interesting perspective in terms of the journey of, at least from a policing perspective, of people's lives and that. And some, really good, but a lot of fallout, a lot of tragedies. When I look back at the people I trained with, I think it was in the first year, somebody was arrested for stealing heroin and engaged with sex workers. A year or two later, somebody was involved in an extremely brutal spousal assault. Then, suicides. And, I'm talking like 3-4 years after training, and that kind of continued on throughout 30 or 40 years, where some of the best guys were, charged criminally for extortion. And, then, as probably one of the guys I was, another guy off, like I'm talking just processing all these guys that were really good friends. Another guy off for extremely acute paranoia to the where they had to put his wife in security because of the mental health issues. They thought that he was going to kill his wife. To then, more in terms of contemporary times, another one of my close friends who's recently arrested for allegations working with the Chinese government in Canada, which when you kind of reflect on all that, from the suicides to the heroin trafficking to the espionage cases, and you look back, back then when you joined, you thought you're kind of the best of the best and the strongest of the strongest. And you look at the fragility of humans, in terms of the journey, and in this particular case, in terms of policing and that. And it's kind of sad reflecting on it, but it's I guess it's just kind of part of life, and I'm sure other professions are similar to that.
Now, when you completed Depot, what was your first posting coming out of RCMP basic training?
So first posting, everybody was supposed to almost exclusively go to Vancouver, and everybody was planning and conspiring to get 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom apartments and continue the camaraderie of Depot. And most of them did go to Vancouver because it was Expo 86 that year. But somehow I lost the lotto, and I got sent to the only place in British Columbia where they had a fly-in patrols, where fly in for a week, depending on the weather, sometimes longer, in terms of Indigenous communities in northern BC. And for a single guy, it was something I reflect on and I enjoy. But as a 23-year-old kid, I could think of better places to be than a fly-in place by myself, stuck, nothing to do other than maybe go catch a fish that day or look at the mountains for that day. But there's no roads, no cars, no street lights, no TV, no nothing, and it's like, how did I end up here, And so I did that for, I think, 2.5 years, and I think somebody felt sorry for me, and because I was working so hard all the time, and got me out of there, and got me transferred to Vancouver eventually.
Do you ever? I wonder if your time in Norway House contributed to that at all. Did you ever get any sort of sense of why everybody else ended up going to live on False Creek in Vancouver, and you ended up in Mackenzie, BC?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of Depot, you got an assessment, and there was definitely guys that were more physically fit than me. There was guys that were smarter than me, in terms of grades. But I think I probably went to a small town, based when I reflect on the assessment I got. Just I go along with people, so I wouldn't have a problem getting along in a small town. I was a little more easygoing, maybe a little more, I would think, balanced than some others, and had the ability, I think, to deal with a diversity of different issues. And I think it's like some really good guys went to the big cities, for sure, undoubtedly. But I think there's a tendency to hide people in the big cities in terms of policing. And, you go to a town of 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 people, you can't really hide in terms of policing. And you're going to have a lot of problems if you have personality. So I think they take that into consideration when they decide where you're going to go. And then I think they went, hey, this guy's been into all these fly-in places. He did well when he was there. We're going to use him and fill that void. And that's how I ended up there. And I was the only single guy there for the first while. It wasn't a ton of fun.
What did you do in Vancouver when you came out of Mackenzie?
So when I came out of Mackenzie, I was actually earmarked to go for the first time. They were going to have a program for money laundering, and I was 25 maybe, and I was really an aggressive drug enforcer, so to speak, in a very small town. So I wasn't like doing big international stuff. So they sent me down there with the intention of going to law school, which never happened. It did, but I did it on my own, not with the RCMP. So I went down to, they were supposed to send me to Vancouver Drugs, and then I got sent down to, because of administrative issues with vacancies, that they had to fill the municipal ones before the federal ones. So I ended up in Coquitlam, which is a suburb of Vancouver, in uniform for 9 months, and then moved on to plain clothes shortly thereafter, into a street crime unit, then a drug unit, then another drug unit, etc.
So what did Vancouver sort of street crime or criminality look like back then?
So when I first went to plain clothes, it was kind of dealing with people that were involved, and we were a small unit of rather, I'm trying to think what the politically
Eclectic?
correct, not eclectic, I would say forward-leaning policemen in terms of our investigative strategic approach to resolving street crime. And we were looking at armed robbers and commercial break-and enter artists, and these guys were like super sophisticated. When they're doing break-ins, they're doing like for 100,000, 200,000, taking 50 TVs or taking 100 TVs, or cracking a train car with computers on it, and riding the train through different areas, throwing the TVs off and having cars pick it up. They were like pretty sophisticated guys. They're all mostly, sadly, all drug addicts, mostly coke, some meth, but mostly coke addicts and that we were working. And then I went into drug enforcement like 9 months later, after I did the street crimes 18 months later. I did street crimes for 18 months. Then I went to Coquitlam drug sector, and it was mostly dealing with the Hells Angels associate, and that was kind of interesting because it kind of took me back to growing up in Winnipeg, which we talked about, and having that resiliency. And some of my friends still talk to me about it. I think that growing up where I grew up in Winnipeg, and talking about risk, I just didn't have that. I was somewhat desensitized to what other people saw as high risk. I saw as maybe medium risk. So I would have a lot of confrontational interactions with the organized criminals, and particularly the bikers. I found most people like somewhat intimidated by them. But I was, growing up in Winnipeg in the neighborhood, I guess I probably grew up there, and just. And then plus working in Norway House, working in Fort Ware in northern BC, my mentality was always, the worst thing you can do is back down. And the most effective way to deal with them, that I learned in grade 5, grade 6, dealing with bullies was kind of just being straight up and kind of taking every approach and interaction as if there were going to be a bully, just go game on, even though I may have been not as big as some of these guys, and maybe there was 3 or 4 or whatever. So I did that a lot. So that's what I kind of was a little known for, and I kind of reflecting, because we had a little bit of reunion of a bunch of guys here recently, and we were talking about these type of stories dealing with the bikers and the drug dealers and that. So I continued doing that. Then I went to Vancouver Drugs, and then it was much more non-street orientated, where we're targeting international motherships of the marine environment, of ships bringing in containers, in the multi-ton level, around the world and that. So I did that for another couple of years. And I was kind of all inspired. You may ask me down the road here at some point, but I'll just interject with it. Is it wasn't until a couple of years ago, actually, that I reflected, how did I ended up with this career in this higher end organized crime and that, and it really came back probably to exposure when I was a teenager to the movie French Connection and Gene Hackman in it, and I do laugh. I'm laughing now at it because I grew up as a pretty soft spoken kid, according to my parents, and I grew up to be somebody that I would say that my mom didn't recognize later on in life, and she was always, jokingly and affectionately going, "I don't know whatever happened to my little boy," but maybe a little like Gene Hackman in that show, maybe a little edgy, maybe sometimes even too edgy, for the workplace, and like very, very aggressive, and but I guess I don't think it was I think it was kind of like Gene Hackman I just cared a lot. And as a result of caring a lot, I developed in that organized crime world an edginess. I had that compassion in terms of always respecting, the drug addicts, the prostitutes, and everybody that I ever interacted with. I was always super respectful if they were respectful to me. But I did definitely, I think, have a reputation of being edgy a bit.
You did a number of overseas deployments with military environments, United Nations. I mean, how did that come about? Because it's certainly not something that is, I think, normative in policing. So how did that first sort of mission in the United Nations Protective Force or UNPROFOR come about for you?
I was single, 1993, recently single, and I just thought, hey, I just want to do something different. I just want to get out of the space I was in. And I was doing some work on the weekend, and I was flipping through my in basket and saw something going, hey, here's this opportunity for the RCMP to deploy to the United Nations. It was the beginning of the war in the former Yugoslavia. I guess it had been going on for just about a year, maybe a couple months more than that. And I thought, I'm single. If I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it now and try something different. I saw it, now that you asked that, I saw it like a couple years earlier than that. And it was the first time the RCMP deployed to Namibia, and I only or on a UN thing, and that was to Namibia. But I don't even think I had 5 years service, and I think it goes right back, now that you asked that question, to me being in grade 8, thinking, hey, I want to help people in Africa. When that came up, I applied for it, and it was kind of like that. Those stories you hear about soldiers trying to join the army when they're 16 or 17, and I was trying to do the same thing to deploy overseas.
So and World War I, World War II.
Yeah. So I was trying to go, hey, how do I go overseas to Africa on this peacekeeping mission? And I knew I didn't meet the criteria, but I still threw in. But they were smart enough; they rejected me. And so then a couple of years later, I saw this one in Yugoslavia, so I applied and I went there. I didn't know what to expect, but I can say what I found was like completely different than what I expected, from a war perspective. Both in terms of very positive experience and a horrific experience blended in one. And as somebody once said to an old good friend of mine, when my friend was telling them about my experience, the person who was somebody that came was with either the Serbian military or the Croatian military. I said to a friend of mine, when my friend said, he just always wanted to be there and go back, basically defined war as, hey, it's kind of like a narcotic. It's got the highest high and the lowest low. So that was kind of my experience there. I got involved in like some extremely interesting work there. I fell into, within a month or so of getting there, dealing with prisoner of war issues, kidnappings, and body exchanges, which is the exchange of dead bodies during the war, which was a big thing. And I spent most of my time in my first tour just doing that work. And it was kind of like the dirty side of the war, but I found it fascinating. More than just fascinating, I found it like extremely rewarding working with not so much the UN. I was almost totally immersed working with the warring parties, separate from the UN, and equally important, the families of those people that were impacted by the war, that had missing people, whether they were, detained in a prisoner of war camp or whether they were dead, buried in a mass grave or whatever else. But even something that, I don't know what the word would be, even getting a family member's body back, and that was extremely rewarding in terms of the work. So, I became somewhat addicted to it, and so I did that. Then I came back for 6 months, I came back permanently, and then about 4 months into it, as we talked earlier, I got a phone call and said, hey, would you be interested in going back to Yugoslavia? And I had done fairly well in my first tour, and I had made some amazing connections at the highest level of government in the warring sides. And they said they were looking at pushing the police part of the mission into central Bosnia, which was still under heavy fighting at that particular time. And they were looking for a couple people in the Canadian contingent that had the profiles, characteristics, and/or experience that they thought they could put in these forward positions with the more intense fighting. So I immediately said yes, and then deployed for the second time and did similar type work in central Bosnia.
When you finished up your time in the former Yugoslavia, is that when the RCMP started to build its own organic negotiation program?
They had a hostage program, and obviously I was doing all this negotiation stuff and kidnapping, but they were just doing regular, what I refer to as crisis negotiations. Somebody barricaded in the house, upset that their wife left, suicidal, blah, 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 mentally unstable, etc. And the odd hostage situation where, somebody's in the bank, gets caught in a crime, they barricade themselves in, they got a couple hostages, whatever. But it was shortly thereafter, in 99, I think it was, there was a kidnapping in, I think it was in Peru, or major hostage taking in Peru. I can't remember what it was. And it was kind of the beginning where the RCMP recognized that they needed this international capacity to respond to international critical incidents involving hostages. And then 9/11 happened, and I was working with NORAD for about a year, and preparing more for terrorist type issues,
like plane hijackings in North American airspace.
Yeah. And other terrorist type of incidents as well. And I think it was right around there they said, hey, we need to develop a unique capacity to deal with these acute national security type incidents through negotiations and so I got involved, at the ground level for that.
Was that a Canadian government or a RCMP specific initiative?
It was driven. Most of the stuff I was doing was within the context of the RCMP, but for the deployments of it, it was Global Affairs Canada eventually. But building the capacity of it was an internal RCMP entity. Although we did, back then we started doing some cross training with the Canadian Armed Forces, JTF2, and doing exercises with them back at the time. But we didn't have that, what I would say, the depth and that. But that started in the early 2000s, post 9/11, and then we started building that capacity, selecting people, training people, and starting to build that capacity, post 9/11, and that. And I was very involved in that. And then the other thing that I was involved in the negotiation world was I got involved dealing with a lot of the Indigenous disputes across Canada in a negotiating capacity with the blockades and the violent protests or protests that were anticipated to be violent to try to make them nonviolent. So joined a regular hostage negotiation team. Then I joined, while I actually kind of one of the founders of creating a conflict negotiation team, which was dealing with disputes across Canada, primarily between the Canadian government and Indigenous communities, sometimes others as well. And then probably in about 2002 or 3, roughly around there, we created a national team for Canada. It was originally called DIRG, then it went to ING, International Negotiation Group, and we were responding to international kidnappings around the world and deploying with the military, JTF2, CSIS, on behalf of supporting GAC in these situations.
Maybe give the listener a bit of a sense of what a situation like that looks like, and how you navigate all of the different elements.
Yeah, and every situation's different. I always say, whether it's kidnapping or whether it's Indigenous, and I honestly was probably the guy say, don't call them Indigenous ones. They would say native disputes or native blockades or whatever else. I'd say, hey, there's always two parties to this thing, and one party is non-Indigenous. And that's why we called it a community conflict team, because it was really, members of the community, including the government, that were engaged in it. And then I say it without, I think what most Canadians would be surprised as I was surprised engaging in these ones. And it would be something like highway number 1 is blocked, and it's, Labor Day long weekend. And they were disputing some land claim issues in that particular area, or blockade of a railway track, like not a railway track, the railway track going into Vancouver. So no railways going to Vancouver. You can imagine the financial implications of that. And, you get 20, 30, 40 people blocking that, including elders and spiritual leaders, which make it really, really difficult in terms of enforcement and that to do. What I found most interesting was, and surprising, I guess, was I found it much easier negotiating, dialoguing, and resolving problems with the Indigenous people. I found it much easier, much more difficult dealing with the Canadian government. And it was really just that lack of, I think, humility, empathy, and a cultural lens, that didn't allow to go, hey, there's two sides to this story. And I'm definitely, I am that Popeye Doyle guy from Gene Hackman, French Connection. But so when I saw this, I'm not like the nicest, warmest person always, and that, but that was my lens on it. I was kind of going, okay, this isn't the problem. This isn't the problem I expected. This is going to be easy to solve this part of the problem. That part of the problem is going to be tougher. And that was dealing with senior bureaucrats that, just knew better. Or some of them, in fairness, half of them had the ego. The other half, in fairness to that, now that I'm reflecting on it, were like, they just didn't see it that way. Like, it was a whole different cultural lens. For example, we were dealing with it's a famous case because there's books about it. There was movies written about it. And I was the lead negotiator on it. And it was a case of a killer whale on the west coast of Canada. And this baby killer whale was interacting in this marina and bumping, the fishing boats, knocking off the different, whatever it is, depth finders underneath the boats and creating havoc. And then, people were out fishing on, like a 20 or 25 foot, recreational boat. And the killer whale would come up on the side of the boat and they would be petting it and feeding it beer and interacting with it almost like a humanistic, it was almost like a human. And the Department of Fisheries was extremely concerned in terms of the safety issues. Something was going to happen with the whale. But the Indigenous community there had just lost their chief. And in their culture was the chief often comes back as a killer whale. And so this killer whale was seen as the spirit of the chief. To the Department of Fisheries, it was seen as an animal that was a nuisance.
A nuisance, right.
And the approach was, let's treat it as a nuisance. And they were looking at hog tying it, literally, pulling it up, and that, and putting it in the Vancouver Aquarium. And I'm dealing with the Indigenous people, and they're going, that's our chief. And so you're sitting down in the community, but, downtown Ottawa, they're having these conversations in their boardrooms about this nuisance and the risk and the liability, and they're going to be criticized if they don't do this and this. Well-intended, but they don't understand that's cheap. So they're looking at, like, injecting it with, like, whatever, putting it up on a truck, shipping it, to Vancouver or whatever, possibility that it's going to die in the process because it's a high-risk type capture type thing. And I just remember going into the number 2 person in charge of the Department of Fisheries in the Pacific region, and he says, "Well, I don't get it. I don't understand why they're looking at protesting and doing these blockades and that." I said to him, I can't remember his name. I'll use the name Jim. I said, "Jim, can you imagine if you were going to church?" I said, "You went to church as a kid?" "Yeah." I said, "Well, what would somebody's reaction be if somebody walked up to the altar and just excremented right on the church altar?" I said, like, totally disrespected your cult, like your religious beliefs, your spirituality, and just did that, knowing that you were told like how spiritual it was. I said, that's basically what the Department of Fisheries is doing to this Indigenous group. This is the most sacred person they have in their community is this whale. It doesn't matter what you see it is. That's what they see it is. And that's why you're getting into it. So it was really, it was really interesting to see that. And to his credit, he went, yeah. Like, it was a game changer for him, right, culturally, for his career. Yeah. And so, like, great, fantastic that, like, he did that. But a lot of people weren't like that. They weren't as open to kind of like listening and having those conversations. They just go, hey, my way. And I look back at it now, and I'm looking now, and there's lots like Indigenous Lives Matter and stuff like that. But when I look at some of the policing interactions that I see where they're going in with 20, 30, 40, 50, tactical guys. I have to question. I've never been in a situation where that ever had to be done if you've actually sat down and had some good conversations with the people and did things strategically. But I kind of think we went a little backwards on that. But that was my experience dealing with that type of stuff.
That's a really, I think that's a great perspective, Cal. And maybe I'll just ask you a question about how your thoughts on the convoy in Ottawa, because you just sort of indicated, if you're doing things in a certain way, then you don't necessarily need that 30 or 40 armed people. I mean, what are your thoughts reflecting on how the convoy in Ottawa was handled?
Yeah. So the first thing, I guess, in fairness, I'll comment, but in fairness, I wasn't there, so my comments are just general observations based on 20 years experience dealing with a lot of this stuff, and particularly inclusive of dealing with war situations. And so I'm always a little skeptical, and I won't go to being critical, but always skeptical. And I can't go to critical because I wasn't here, but I've just found that the culture of policing generally, the way that we're trained and the way that we're hardwired more and more in today's society is, and particularly in the cities, more so than the rural communities of Canada, we're more kind of, hey, action orientated, looking at cost, human resources, going, hey, we've got to get this done, we've got this timeline on it. And the use of force is usually the more effective one when you look at financial costs and that. I say that generally because if it's done wrong, there's huge costs down the road and that. But I don't find, and I never found, even when I was like in 1993, there's 70,000, I think it was, or something like that. I can't remember. 17,000, 70,000 peacekeepers in the former Yugoslavia. I remember sitting with the presidents of the exchange commissions for Serbia. He was like super high level government guy. The guy in Croatia was the same guy. His name was Ivan Gruic, and coincidentally, I'm meeting some of his peers here on a panel in a couple weeks. And I remember, I'll never forget. I was like the youngest kid in that contingent. I was 28, I think, my first tour, maybe 29. And I'm sitting there, and I remember walking up into the Ministry of Defense for Croatia on the 3rd floor, 4th floor, and every door I walked by, and there weren't that many offices. Like, these were big, huge offices they had. And I remember seeing General so-and-so, General so-and-so, and General so-and-so, and I'm like, how did Constable so-and-so get on this floor? And I walk into the room, and I'm having a discussion, and the guy says to me, Calvin, you're the first time somebody from the UN actually walked into our offices and said, you said, you tell me what to do to help you. Nobody's ever come here and said that. You're the first guy in like a year and a half that's actually said, you tell me what to do if I can help you make this war go away. Everybody said, this is what we want you to do. And I think in policing and in government, sometimes I don't think people think that way, and I would be concerned in the Ottawa environment whether that the situation got so out of hand, which I've seen always, that egos, insecurities, politics, aspirations start infusing the process with the wrong people. And I think in that particular one, like most, I would imagine that there was probably the infusion of egos and other things in there. I mean, that's been my experience. In most of this kind of like really interesting stuff, not always, I never had the big challenge dealing with the criminal. I didn't had some challenges dealing with terrorists for sure, and stuff like that, and some didn't work out, as you know. I usually didn't have that many problems with protesters. I was always usually able to get them to, a commonsensical approach is, what do you guys want out of this? I'll get you whatever you want. You tell me what you want, I'll get it for you. and in most cases, that type of thinking I've always found works, but it's not a type of thinking that I see quite often within the government sector. There, it's kind of like negotiating with City Hall. It's like my way, highway type approach, and whether that took place in Ottawa, I don't know, but I'd say my experience would be, if I had any type of predictive analysis, I would anticipate there is some of that influence in that.
We'd spoken about some of the more seminal moments in your career, and the hostage negotiation in the Philippines is one that you indicated really sort of stood out and maybe represented a bit of the beginning of the end for you, the RCMP. Maybe you could give the listener a bit of a rundown on what that kidnapping was about, and why that was an important moment for you.
I had 30 years in and out of conflict zones, war zones, terrorist incidents, negotiating with terrorists in Iraq, Eastern Africa. Then the Philippines came, and like you said, it was probably the beginning of the end of of myself when I reflect on it, on my career. And it was basically two Canadians taken from a marina in the south part of the Philippines. In the classic situation, I got called. I was a team leader of the team. It was like 2016, I believe. And so I got the first phone call. I'm laughing because I think that's how I became the team leader of the team. I was always the guy willing to take the first phone call and do the deployment versus having any other leadership attributes other than answering my phone on time. And so I answered the phone, and they said, "Hey, we've got this situation. The ambassador there is looking for help. What's the chances you'd be able to deploy tomorrow to go to the Philippines?" And so I made some phone calls like I usually do, and everybody had some different challenges in their life. And I said, "Yeah, I'll be on a plane tomorrow." And I remember going on that plane. It was the first time it hit me. Maybe, we've never talked about this. I never even thought about it, but I remember jumping on the plane from Vancouver Airport, jumping on an Air Japan or Japan Airlines or whatever it is, sitting in first class or business class at the front, because they put us there so that when we get there we can work 24 hours around the clock. So I was sitting there thinking to myself, I'm getting kind of old for this, and I've been doing this like for a long time, like 25 years in and out of dealing with these horrible situations. And I remember thinking that when I got onto the plane on the tarmac, going, how did I end up in this crazy life that I have, kind of flying into countries dealing with terrorist kidnappings and hostage situations and executions and that. Anyways, it deployed, went there, set things up, for the negotiations, made all the contacts. I knew some of the Philippine hostage negotiators and that, because I had trained with them internationally before. And then I came back, and then my team replaced, some of my guys replaced me, and then we did rotations on and off for, I guess it was about 10 months, roughly. I guess it was maybe about 9 months, 8 months into it. And I was back in Canada, and they had given the deadline, and a couple of guys on the team, experienced guys, were deployed. But we had a call, and there was a deadline given that the hostage, a hostage was going to get executed. 3 of them were taken, 2 Canadians and 1 Norwegian, and a few locals as well. And so the deadline was coming. I think it was 11 o'clock at night, roughly, going on 12 o'clock at night. And we had the call set up, and I had electronically the ability to monitor and give inputs into the negotiations live time as we're talking to the hostage takers, which were a Islamic extremist organization. I get them all confused in terms of the names of them all now. The deadline was coming up, and they said, "Hey, if you don't pay, gazillion dollars, we're going to execute somebody." And I remember sitting at my kitchen counter, and then, basically saying, "Time up," in not so nice language, and they went to execute the person. You could hear the beginning of it. And I remember I was sitting at my kitchen counter, and not to be distasteful, but I remember sitting there, and I just renovated my whole house. And this is where the beginning of the end starts, because I remember, for years after, sitting at that kitchen counter usually brought back that memory. But anyways, fast forward a couple months later, they had another deadline, and so the same deadline. And at that point, the Australians were looking at, the Norwegians were looking at paying. I was the Australians were looking at paying. I had two younger guys there. I was back in Vancouver on a rotation out. So I asked Ottawa, "Hey, can I go? I don't want those guys to be there by themselves when, it looked like it was going to be another execution." So I deployed, met with the Norwegians. That didn't go that well. I think after my meeting with the Norwegians, because they had agreed to do things collaboratively, strategically together, and I met with them as soon as I landed. I think it was probably 4 hours later I got called into the Canadian ambassador's office and said, "Hey, I just got a call from the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Canada, who got a phone call from the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Norway several hours ago, and I was asked to be banned from the Norwegian embassy and required not to interact with the Norwegians anymore." A sense of betrayal. To the ambassador's credit, he thanked me for doing it, but said, I still have to tell you that. He said, I know why you did it. It was the right thing to do. Somebody had to do it, and thanks for you doing it." So I think it was the next day, the deadline came, and we were trying extremely difficult, engaging with the terrorist group, having conversations, but we knew again was going to happen. So they got executed, the second Canadian, and it was extremely difficult, I think, because we were like part of the process. It wasn't as if like it was a homicide and happened like last night and I was in bed and somebody got whatever. But you're part of the process, and the whole team was part of the process. So it had a significant impact on everybody. It had a big impact on me for sure. And I think it was probably, that last drop of water in the glass. And I just went, I don't think I recognized it right then. When I reflect on it, I should have recognized it, but I didn't. And then shortly thereafter, like several years after, like 2 years after, I retired. But if I really reflect on why did I retire, it was probably, I just thought physical health, mental health, 30 years in and out of war zones, time to hang up the spurs and retire and do something else. So that's what I did.
And then you didn't do something else.
I did something else. I went into the private sector. I came home that day because I had no plans to retire. I just made this really quick decision and to retire. There was some organizational anxiety about it because they knew that I had a career that was exposed to a lot of trauma. So that because of the quickness of it, they automatically assumed it was that. But it was I just felt tired. I just thought I'm losing my edge. I'm gonna go. So I drove home from work that day, didn't tell anybody I quit, but I was going to write an email. My girlfriend at the time, now wife, says, what are you going to do? And I said, going to be a bartender. And I just want to do something different. And as you alluded to with your comment, then all my former military friends started calling me several weeks later saying, hey, somebody here got kidnapped, or somebody went back, is missing in Syria. Somebody got taken to Lebanon. And the next thing you know, I'm back in the same game. I'm in the private sector, and that's what I'm doing now. Not just kidnappings, but a little broader than that, with a corporate business that does a lot of high-risk type of activities ranging from kidnappings to espionage, national security, due diligence, intelligence, like a whole bunch of different stuff, investigations.
Based on decades of dealing with risk, violence, and working in all sorts of parts of the world, I mean, is there any sort of advice that you'd give to Canadians on how to assess risk when they're deciding where to travel to, or maybe take a work position somewhere?
Well, I think, if you asked me that question a month ago, I would have given you answer X. If you asked me that 2 years ago, I would have said Y. If you asked me 5 years ago, I would have said Z. And if you ask me tomorrow, I'll probably come up with a different answer than today, because the world is so fluid right now in terms of risk and security and that. And I think and it's not only traveling abroad, it's even because I've worked a lot with the diaspora communities in Canada, and we know the headlines recently with allegations regarding India, Chinese interference, Iranian interference in operatives here. Is not only I think and I put a lot of responsibility on the Canadian government, that I think that we have not done a great job educating Canadians and the youth as to what's the real world like. I definitely, in my travels found that, somebody would say to me, well, what you're saying is not the real world. I'm going, yeah, it is the real world. Canada's not the real world. Out there, it's a whole different world out there. In Canada, we've been so fortunate, going all the way back to, my grandfather, who was a vet in World War II, creating this great country, that whatever. But I do think Canadians have a false sense of reality as to what that world looks like. Definitely around the world, and they have to be cautious of it and know that it's going to, like, things are so unpredictable now, going into countries. Now you don't know. I mean, you even get travel warnings, for those in the U.S. and the U.K. is putting out travel warnings about even traveling to Canada and stuff like that. So traveling, super high risk. But I would say even just living in these communities, these times, like particularly, large diaspora communities, there is foreign operations taking place in Canada. They come out and say India. Well, I guarantee, I know for a fact China, I know for a fact Iran is here. And I'm sure a whole host of other countries doing nasty things to people and stuff like that. So, some of the subtleties in terms of the threats may be just like inside threats, that maybe not, hey, a kidnapping or a terrorist or a violent attack, in terms of a bomb in Spain or something going off at a tourist location. But also just not to create a whole degree of paranoia, but the world's becoming much more polarized, and in reality, and we didn't talk that much about it, we're in kind of this thing where people are saying, hey, do you think we're going to go to war? Do you think we're not? I already think we're in a war right now, and Canadians just need to have that awareness that some countries see us as the adversary, and when they're traveling, abroad, or even when they're here, living in Canada, they just have to be aware of this consideration that we're living at times that are highly volatile and pose a risk to everybody, I think, and not just to certain individuals and that. And I know myself, because even myself, I've found myself in some security situations where I'm even concerned for my own safety. And if it's not my own personal safety, I'm even worried about it from a cyber perspective, where I'm going to be not just a coincidental click and get scammed, but where I'm actually being targeted because of the type of work I do or something else. So, yeah, I think Canadians just have to up their game and kind of wake up a bit.
We'll close the podcast off, Cal, with a question I ask everybody about if you have a recommendation, and I'm excited to hear yours because you're in Vancouver, so in fact, I think almost all the podcast guests so far have been in and around the sort of Ottawa, Toronto area. I mean, so do you have a recommendation for the listeners that'll either educate, entertain them when they're out in Vancouver, or maybe a cause that you'd like to elevate?
I'm going to take two at that one and grab two without asking if I could. I'm going to put a plug in for a former military intelligence officer who just wrote a book called The Mosaic Effect. And it's a book regarding Chinese influence in Canada, particularly focused in Vancouver. And the author is Scott McGregor and Ina Mitchell. And I gave you a book before you walked in the room. I got to put a plug on that because I think it's really important for Canadians to take a look at it. And I know it was a real struggle, in terms of him, working through the business aspect of getting a book published like that and the risk attached to it legally. So I have to put a plug there. But the other plug, and it's more a personal plug directed towards you, is when you're in Vancouver to do the Grouse Grind, which is a rather intense climb up the side of a mountain in Vancouver. And I would say it's probably been the best medicinal kind of effect in terms of, putting 30 years behind me and being able to shape those 30 years in terms of very positive memories and, leading me to kind of having not only a happy life, but a healthy life after 30 years of the School of Hard Knocks.
Cal, it's been awesome to have a chance to meet you in person and sitting down and do this. And thanks again for being one of our Northern Sentinels.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a great podcast. I look forward to listening to some of your other guests as well.
You can find information in the show notes on the RCMP Basic Training at Depot, the Philippines kidnapping, the recently released book, The Mosaic Effect, and the Grouse Grind hike in Vancouver. Thanks for listening to the NSP, and goodbye until next time.